Yesterday was primary day for certain Republican races, Arizona, Missouri, Michigan, and here with us to break it all down is the Hill's political reporter, Julia Manchester. Hello, Julia.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yep, we absolutely wanted you on to discuss these fascinating results. So I'm seeing in Arizona, Blake Masters won, and Kari Lake looks likely to win ahead, but it's not for sure. Can you update us?
Yeah. So it looks like Kari Lake is definitely has the lead, and it doesn't seem like she's going to give up that lead. And obviously, you have Blake Masters winning, but also conservative election denier Mark Fincham winning the Republican nominee for Secretary of State. And then we know that Senator David Farnsworth was able to oust Arizona House Speaker Rusty Bowers. So really a win for a lot of Trump's endorsed candidates in Arizona, but a lot of these candidates also happen to be election deniers. And it's really unclear how that will play out going into a general election in Arizona, which is such a purple state. I mean, Arizona has produced politicians like John McCain, Kyrsten Sinema, Mark Kelly. These aren't people that have necessarily ran to the left or the right. They're relatively moderate when it comes to campaigning. So I'm curious to see if President Trump's endorsed candidates curtail their messaging to maybe focusing on the national environment instead of an election that happened 2 years ago. We'll have to see. We know that there are some Democrats who were trying to boost a lot of these candidates because they thought they could be easier to take on in the general election. But, that could prove to be a risky strategy. So I'll be talking to sources about this today to see what they think. But certainly a fascinating general election scenario coming out.
Speaking of that did come to pass in Michigan with Representative Peter Meijer, who's one of the Republican House members who voted to impeach Donald Trump, has faced this very tough primary challenge from John Gibbs, who is endorsed by Trump and then received, as we've talked about on the show twice now, received a campaign contribution essentially from the DCCC, this advertisement trying to, make Republican voters think that this is the more conservative candidate, and it worked. Peter Meijer is now projected to have lost that race. So then the Democratic theory being that Gibbs will be easier to defeat in the general election in this district that is now more Democratic leaning than it was when Peter Meijer initially won. So we're gonna have a test of that strategy, because the Gibbs could absolutely still win, and then Democrats will have merely contributed to an effort to actually elect a far more far right candidate, and a candidate who thinks that the election was in some sense stolen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating dynamic. And look, I think it's a risky strategy on their part. And I think a lot of it depends on the messaging that a lot of these Republican candidates go off of. If these Republican candidates who have spent the primary talking about the presidential election that happened 2 years ago, and they ignore making this a referendum on the Biden administration itself, it's going to be so easy for Democrats to say, look, I'm going to be the lawmaker or the politician who's going to help you tackle the issues of inflation or higher crime or the situation at the southern border. It's going to be so easy for Democrats to focus on those issues because the Republican candidates may not be focusing on those issues. However, if the Republican candidates maybe pivot their messaging towards talking more about the economy or more about the present day versus an event that happened 2 years ago, that could play in their favor, considering the national environment appears to be in favor of Republicans. We'll have to see, but a lot of establishment Republican figures like Doug Ducey, like former Vice President Mike Pence, I imagine, are very concerned this morning because they're concerned that these Republican nominees now aren't focusing on the right messaging.
Julia, another big story out of last night came out of Kansas, where the voters there defeated a ballot measure that would have paved the way for a state ban on abortion. This was surprising to many folks, given the red nature of the state. To what do you attribute that win for pro-choice advocates?
I thought this was so fascinating because when I was looking at the polling in the lead up to primary day in Kansas on this issue, you actually saw the anti-abortion rights side of the debate appearing to lead, and it seemed like a lot of political observers were saying they'll be able to eke out some sort of victory. But no, the turnout was really incredible for those looking to preserve abortion rights in Kansas, and I think it speaks to the turnout apparatus and the resources that Democrats and abortion rights organizations are pouring into states like Kansas, which is a very conservative state. That being said, though, I'm hearing a lot of Democrats and abortion rights advocates saying this morning, well, this is an omen for Republicans and anti-abortion advocates going into November. This shows that the base is fired up over this issue. That's very true. However, the majority of Americans, when they head to the polls in November, they're not going to be voting yes or no on a ballot initiative. They're going to be voting for a candidate, and that candidate is going to be talking about a number of issues, whether that's inflation, crime, the border, gas prices, abortion. There's so much ground to cover. So the question is whether abortion is a priority for voters. And the polling that we have seen shows it's not a top priority for the majority of voters. So, however, I think it's a fair point to say that this is evidence that you can turn out on the issue of abortion. I think you're going to see Democrats and those on the abortion rights side of the debate really trying to push that.
And we also wanted to talk about the war of the two Erics, in which Donald Trump endorsed Eric. This is the Missouri race between Eric Greitens and Eric Schmidt. And Eric Schmidt so this is for the Senate seat, U.S. Senate seat in Missouri. Schmidt was victorious by, I think, almost a wider than expected margin, this being the candidate that is by far preferred by the Republican establishment, given that Greitens has this extreme scandal-plagued past. And I think they were worried about him as a general election candidate, even in Missouri. So this one is certainly breathing a sigh of relief for Republican leadership, who the people who are worried about Trump candidates, going too far and being off message for general elections. Is that right?
Yes, such a sigh of relief. We saw a lot of money going into Eric Schmidt, and actually a lot of resources also going into Vicky Hartzler, who was running in that race as well. And talking to sources on the ground in Missouri, they would say that, to defeat Eric Greitens, because we know that Eric Greitens was leading in the polls at some point during this campaign, it would take two candidates to bring him down. And I think that third candidate with Vicky Hartzler very much could have played a role in that. But in terms of the Trump endorsement, look, after a lot of these primaries this cycle, a lot of us are writing pieces as, reflecting over what did we learn about the Trump endorsement? Was it a good night for him? Was it not a good night for him? Well, I guess Trump can technically claim victory because he did endorse Eric. Maybe you could say he didn't win because another Eric lost. I don't know, but it's just my favorite. That's just the funny. It's something out of Veep or The Onion, honestly.
Yeah, there is this push to kind of come out of these things with grand narratives. Did Trump have a win? Did progressives have a losing night? When so often the real story is, did progressive losses really prove the strength of some of these groups like AIPAC and DMFI, who've thrown millions of dollars at making sure the squad doesn't get any bigger? And what are the progressives going to do about that if they want to stand any chances going forward? But thank you so much for joining us, Julia.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.